The sanctuary fell silent as Dr. Jennifer Thompson's trembling hands lowered her phone, the call from the live stream coordinator cutting through her disbelief like a blade. 50 million views in 24 hours. The world had watched Leon cry real tears at his savior's funeral, and now everyone wanted answers she couldn't give. "Lions don't cry, Jen," the reporter had pressed, her voice sharp with skepticism. "So, what exactly did we witness?" The coffee mug slipped from Miguel Rodriguez's grip, shattering against the concrete floor as he stared at the computer screen displaying the viral video. His father's funeral had become a global phenomenon, Leon's impossible grief captured in high definition for the world to dissect and debate. Through the office window, Leon's empty enclosure stretched before them. The magnificent lion had died exactly 24 hours after Samuel "Pops" Rodriguez, their hearts stopping in perfect synchronization. "We need to tell them the truth," Miguel whispered, his voice cracking with 30 years of buried pain. But which truth? That animals could love deeper than humans? That his father had died believing his son was still missing in Vietnam? Or that some bonds transcend death itself? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Big Cat Sanctuary of the Keys stretched across 40 acres of tropical paradise in Islamorada, Florida, where the morning sun painted golden streaks across the mangrove waters. Here, among the swaying palms and coral stone pathways, Samuel "Pops" Rodriguez had built something extraordinary from the ashes of his broken dreams. At 72, Pops carried himself with the weathered dignity of a man who had seen too much death and chosen to nurture life instead. His gray beard framed a face mapped with laugh lines and scars, while his hands, permanently stained with iodine and animal feed, spoke of decades spent healing creatures that others had given up on. The slight limp from his left leg, a souvenir from Vietnam shrapnel, never slowed his daily rounds through the sanctuary he had founded 20 years ago with his military pension and stubborn Cuban determination. "Mijo, family ain't about blood," he would tell anyone who listened, his accented English carrying the warmth of Havana streets and the wisdom of hard-won experience. "It's about showing up every damn day, even when your heart's breaking." Dr. Jennifer Thompson understood this philosophy better than most. At 36, the veterinarian from Ohio had traded a lucrative practice for the humid chaos of wildlife rehabilitation drawn by Pop's vision of second chances. For 8 years, she had been his right hand, learning to see past the surface wounds to the deeper scars that marked both animals and humans. Tall and angular, with prematurely gray streaks in her auburn hair, Jen possessed the kind of quiet strength that calmed panicked animals and earned the trust of broken men. She never spoke about why she had really come to Florida, or why the sight of Pops cleaning his Purple Heart medal sometimes brought tears to her eyes. Some secrets were too heavy to share, even with the man she had come to love as a father. The sanctuary's crown jewel was Leon, a magnificent 450-pound African lion whose amber eyes held depths of intelligence that unsettled visitors. Rescued from an illegal circus at 6 months old, Leon bore a distinctive scar over his left eye, a reminder of human cruelty that had somehow transformed into a mark of character rather than damage. His relationship with Pops defied everything experts believed about wild animal behavior. Leon responded to Spanish whispered in his ear, slept outside Pops's trailer every night, and showed protective instincts that bordered on the supernatural. When Pops worked late, Leon would pace his enclosure until the old man appeared for their evening ritual. A one-way conversation conducted through chain-link fence where Pops shared the day's victories and defeats with his most trusted confidant. "That lion loves you more than most people love their own children," Jen had observed one evening. watching Leon rest his massive head against the fence where Pops's weathered palm pressed from the other side. "Maybe," Pops had replied, his voice heavy with old grief. "Or maybe he just understands what it means to lose everything and still choose to trust again." The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in July when Hurricane Isabella's remnants finally moved inland, leaving behind $200,000 in damage and the bitter taste of insurance betrayal. Pop stood in the wreckage of the main building, water still dripping from the collapsed roof, holding a denial letter that might as well have been a death sentence. "Flood damage excluded under Section 12B," he read aloud to Jen, his voice hollow with disbelief. 20 years of premiums, and they find some damn fine print to crawl through. The numbers were brutal and unforgiving. Monthly operating expenses ran $15,000. Food, veterinary supplies, utilities, insurance for the remaining structures. Income from educational tours and donations barely reached $8,000 on good months. Pops's personal savings, accumulated over decades of military pension and careful living, had dwindled to $12,000. At this rate, they had 60 days before bankruptcy would force them to surrender their animals to whoever would take them. Leon sensed the tension immediately. The great cat paced his enclosure with restless energy, his amber eyes tracking Pop's increasingly frantic movements as the old man tried to salvage what he could from the storm damage. When Pops didn't appear for their evening ritual, Leon's low, rumbling calls echoed across the sanctuary until dawn. It was during this chaos that Marcus Whitfield first appeared, emerging from a black Tesla like some corporate specter in an expensive suit. Tall and lean, with silver threading through his dark hair, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. His eyes, an unusual shade of amber that Jen noticed immediately, surveyed the storm damage with calculating precision. "Mr. Rodriguez," he said, extending a manicured hand that Pops reluctantly shook, "I understand you're in a tough spot. I represent some investors who might be interested in helping." The offer was simple and devastating. $2.2 million for 40 acres of prime Florida Keys real estate. Enough to pay off debts, relocate the animals, and leave Pops with a comfortable retirement. All he had to do was sign away 20 years of his life's work. "What would happen to Leon and the others?" Pops asked, though he already suspected the answer. Marcus's smile never wavered. "The lions would be relocated to appropriate facilities. We have connections with several excellent zoos and private reserves. They'd be well cared for, I assure you." Something about the man set Pop's teeth on edge. Marcus knew too much. Personal details about the sanctuary's finances, Pops's military service record, even the names of animals that had died years before public records were kept. When pressed about his sources, Marcus simply smiled and changed the subject. "Progress doesn't wait for sentiment, Mr. Rodriguez. This area is prime for development. Luxury resorts, marina access, helicopter landing pads. Your little sanctuary is charming, but it's not economically viable." The conversation was interrupted by Pops collapsing while feeding the injured pelican they called Hemingway. One moment he was standing, the next he was on his knees in the dirt, clutching his abdomen as waves of agony washed over him. Jen found him there 20 minutes later, curled in a fetal position beside the scattered fish buckets. The emergency room diagnosis hit like artillery fire. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, with metastasis to the liver. Dr. Martinez, a kind-faced oncologist who spoke with the careful precision of someone delivering life sentences, laid out the options with clinical detachment. "With aggressive chemotherapy and radiation, we might extend your life 6 to 9 months, she explained, showing Pops the CT scans that looked like abstract art painted in shades of doom. "Without treatment, you're looking at 3 to 4 months, possibly less." Pop stared at the images of his own mortality for a long moment before shaking his head. I ain't spending my last months puking in some hospital bed while my animals wonder where I went. Dad, you can't just give up, Jen pleaded, using the word that had slipped out naturally over the years. We'll figure out the sanctuary situation. Your health comes first. But Pops had already made his choice. He saw the way Leon had stopped eating during his 3-day hospital stay, the way the great cat had pressed himself against the fence closest to the parking lot, waiting for a familiar truck that never came. Some bonds transcended human understanding, and Pops wouldn't break this one for a few extra months of suffering. The veterinary examination that revealed Leon's kidney disease came the following week, while Pops was still recovering from his hospital discharge. Jen kept the results to herself. Early-stage renal failure, treatable with expensive medication, but ultimately progressive. Leon was dying too, just more slowly and quietly than his human companion. As if sensing the weight of secrets around him, Leon's behavior grew increasingly protective. He refused food from anyone but Pops, positioned himself between his enclosure and visiting strangers, and began making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like conversation whenever Pops approached. Marcus returned with a revised offer, $2.5 million with a 30-day deadline. This time, he brought county officials who implied that a thorough inspection might find violations that could shut down the sanctuary immediately. The message was clear: sell voluntarily or lose everything through bureaucratic warfare. Some things ain't for sale, boy, Pops told him, meeting those familiar amber eyes with growing suspicion. You wouldn't understand. Marcus's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw and wounded underneath. Maybe I understand more than you think, old man. The turning point came 8 weeks before Pops would draw his final breath, though none of them knew the countdown had already begun. Marcus returned to the sanctuary with the persistence of a man carrying 30 years of buried rage, his black Tesla crunching over the gravel drive like an omen of corporate inevitability. This time, he brought reinforcements. County officials with clipboards and measuring tapes, their presence transforming what had been a private negotiation into a public spectacle. The message was unmistakable: cooperate or face the full weight of bureaucratic warfare. Mr. Rodriguez, Marcus said, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone accustomed to victory, I'm prepared to make a final offer. $2.5 million, but I need an answer within 30 days. The officials spread across the sanctuary like locusts, documenting every minor code violation they could find. A loose board on the pelican habitat. Outdated signage missing required safety warnings. A gate latch that didn't meet current specifications written after the sanctuary had been built. Each infraction was another weapon in Marcus's arsenal. Another pressure point to squeeze until Pops surrendered. Progress doesn't wait for sentiment, Marcus continued, his amber eyes surveying the property with calculating precision. This land has tremendous potential for luxury development. Marina access, helicopter landing pads, resort facilities that could employ hundreds of locals. Pops watched the inspection with growing fury, his weathered hands clenched into fists as strangers poked and prodded at 20 years of his life's work. But it was Marcus's casual use of a specific phrase that stopped him cold. Of course, if you're determined to fight this, well. Marcus shrugged with theatrical indifference. Charlie don't surf, as they say. The words hit Pops like shrapnel. It was a quote from Apocalypse Now, a movie he'd watched obsessively in the years after Vietnam, trying to make sense of what they'd all endured. But more than that, it was something he'd said to his squad during the war. A bitter joke about the absurdity of fighting in a place where the enemy seemed to melt into the landscape like water. Only one person had ever heard him use that phrase: his son, Miguel, during a rare moment of openness about the war when the boy was 16. Miguel, who had died in a helicopter crash in 1971, or so the military had told him. Miguel, whose body was never recovered, whose death had hollowed out Pops's soul and sent him stumbling through decades of survivor's guilt. The coincidence was impossible to ignore, yet too devastating to fully accept. Pops began studying Marcus with new eyes, noting details that had seemed insignificant before. The way he ran his fingers through his hair when nervous, exactly like Miguel used to do before baseball games. And the scar on his left wrist, in the same place Miguel had cut himself on broken glass as a child. The amber eyes that were uncommon but not unique, except when they flashed with anger in a way that transported Pops back 30 years. That night, while Leon paced restlessly in his enclosure, sensing the emotional turbulence radiating from his human companion, Pops made a decision that would consume his remaining savings. He hired a private investigator with $2,000 he couldn't afford to spare, driven by a father's intuition that refused to be silenced. The results came back within a week, delivered in a manila envelope that shook in Pop's arthritic hands. Marcus Whitfield had legally changed his name in 1995, with his previous identity sealed by court order. Birth records showed he'd been born in Key West in 1975, which would make him the right age if Miguel had somehow survived and been held captive for years. The timeline was impossible, yet it aligned with a father's desperate hope. Meanwhile, Jen was fighting her own battle with devastating news. Leon's latest blood work revealed accelerated kidney deterioration, his condition worsening faster than she'd anticipated. The proud lion who had once commanded his territory with regal authority now tired easily, his magnificent frame gradually diminishing as his body began the slow process of shutting down. The cost of Leon's palliative care was bleeding them dry, $500 a week for medications that only delayed the inevitable. Jen faced an impossible choice. Tell Pops that his beloved companion was dying, adding another crushing weight to shoulders already bowed with cancer and financial ruin, or carry the secret alone while watching both man and lion fade away. She chose silence, administering Leon's medications in secret while documenting his decline in journals she hid from Pops. But Leon seemed to sense the deception, his amber eyes following her with an intelligence that suggested he understood far more than anyone realized about his own mortality. The sanctuary's financial situation reached catastrophic levels. The electricity was shut off, forcing them to rely on a temperamental generator that coughed and wheezed like an old man's lungs. Insurance companies sent final notices. The bank scheduled foreclosure proceedings. In desperation, Pops pawned his Purple Heart medal, the one tangible proof of his service and sacrifice, for $800 that wouldn't even cover a week's operating expenses. The community remained divided. Some locals supported Marcus's development plans, viewing the sanctuary as a romantic anachronism that stood in the way of economic progress. Others rallied behind Pops, organizing benefit dinners and fundraising drives that raised money in heartbreakingly small amounts. A heated town hall meeting devolved into shouting matches about progress versus preservation, with Marcus playing the role of reasonable businessman opposed by sentimental fools. Through it all, Leon's behavior grew increasingly mysterious. The great cat began collecting Pop's belongings, his favorite hat, work gloves, even tools dropped carelessly around the sanctuary. Leon would carry these items to his sleeping area, arranging them in patterns that seemed deliberate and meaningful. When visitors commented on this strange behavior, Pops would joke that Leon was becoming a pack rat in his old age, but privately he wondered if the lion somehow sensed that their time together was running short. Marcus's psychological warfare intensified. He began appearing at the sanctuary without permission, chatting with neighbors about safety concerns posed by aging infrastructure and increasingly desperate caretakers. Anonymous reports to animal control resulted in surprise inspections that found minor violations. Marcus's legal team immediately weaponized into evidence of negligence. The breaking point came when Pops was hospitalized for 3 days with severe abdominal pain, leaving Jen to manage the sanctuary alone. She returned from visiting him to find Leon pressed against the fence closest to the parking lot, his eyes scanning every approaching vehicle for the familiar sight of Pop's battered truck. The great cat had barely eaten in Pop's absence, and his plaintive calls echoed across the property like grief made audible. "I can't do this alone anymore," Jen confessed to Pops during one of their whispered hospital conversations. "The animals know something's wrong. Leon won't eat. The others are stressed. Maybe Marcus is right. Maybe it's time to let go." But Pop's response surprised her with its quiet steel. "We're not selling, mija. But there's something I need to tell you first." His eyes held a mixture of hope and terror that made Jen's heart race. "I think I know who Marcus really is, and if I'm right, everything changes." The next day, Pops made a phone call that would shatter 30 years of carefully constructed walls. He asked Marcus to meet him at the sanctuary at sunset, just the two of them, with no lawyers or officials or witnesses, just a dying old man and the stranger who might be his greatest miracle or his final heartbreak. Marcus agreed, arriving early in his expensive suit but with trembling hands that betrayed his own emotional investment in whatever was about to unfold. He found Leon waiting by the fence, and for the first time, the great cat didn't growl at his approach. Instead, Leon studied him with those intelligent amber eyes, as if recognizing something that human vision had missed. The weeks that followed Marcus's arrival felt like watching a slow-motion collision between past and present, with Pops caught in the devastating space between hope and heartbreak. His private investigator's findings lay spread across his kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that might complete the picture of his shattered family or destroy what little piece he'd managed to build. Marcus Whitfield's sealed records told a story of deliberate erasure, a man who had systematically eliminated every trace of his previous identity in 1995, emerging from legal obscurity with enough capital to fund a series of increasingly successful business ventures. The timeline haunted Pops through sleepless nights. 1995 was 24 years after Miguel's reported death, exactly the span of time a young soldier might need to survive captivity, escape, and build a new life from the ashes of the old. But hope was a dangerous luxury for a dying man, and Pops forced himself to consider alternatives. Perhaps Marcus had simply researched his background thoroughly, learning personal details the way any good businessman would study a target. Perhaps the physical similarities were coincidence, the behavioral echoes nothing more than wishful thinking projected by a grieving father's desperate imagination. Leon seemed to sense his human companion's inner turmoil. The great cat's behavior grew increasingly protective, positioning himself between Pops and visiting strangers, his amber eyes tracking every movement with predatory intensity. When Marcus appeared for unannounced visits, Leon's reaction was puzzling, not the territorial aggression he showed other intruders, but a watchful stillness that suggested recognition rather than threat assessment. "That lion knows something," Jen observed during one of Marcus's inspections, watching Leon pace restlessly while maintaining visual contact with the businessman. "Look at his body language. He's not afraid or angry. He's curious." The sanctuary's financial death spiral accelerated despite desperate attempts at fundraising. The local Cuban-American community organized benefit dinners that raised $18,000, a gesture of solidarity that brought tears to Pop's eyes but barely dented their mounting debts. Social media campaigns attracted attention from animal lovers nationwide, generating sympathy and small donations that helped with day-to-day expenses, but couldn't address the fundamental crisis. Meanwhile, Pops's health deteriorated with brutal efficiency. The cancer spread through his body like wildfire, consuming his strength and appetite while leaving his mind cruelly sharp. He began making secret recordings on an old cassette player, documenting each animal's care requirements and behavioral quirks for whoever would inherit his life's work. "Leon needs his breakfast at exactly 7:30, he whispered into the machine during one of his midnight sessions. "Not 7, not 8, 7:30 or he gets anxious. And he likes his meat cut in strips, not chunks. Reminds him of the way his mother would have fed him in the wild, I think." The recordings became confessional, filled with regrets and unfinished business that weighed on his soul like stones. He spoke about Miguel's death, the guilt that had driven him to the bottle for years afterward, the way he'd failed as a father by choosing military duty over family presence. He talked about the animals he'd been unable to save, the funding requests he should have pursued more aggressively, the relationships he'd damaged through his obsessive devotion to creatures that couldn't speak their gratitude. But mostly he talked about Leon, the magnificent lion who had become both redemption and responsibility, proving that love could transcend species barriers when offered without conditions or expectations. "I know he's just an animal," Pops murmured into the recorder one night, his voice thick with morphine and exhaustion. "But sometimes when I look into his eyes, I see Miguel. Not literally, I'm not that far gone yet. But I see the same kind of intelligence, the same capacity for loyalty that got my boy killed trying to save his squad mates. Maybe that's why Leon chose me. Maybe we recognize damage in each other." Jen discovered the recordings by accident while searching for Leon's medical files, and listening to them broke her heart in ways she hadn't expected. Here was the man who had become her father figure in everything but blood, pouring out a lifetime of pain and love to a machine because he couldn't bear to burden the living with his emotional weight. She also found something else in Pop's desk drawer, a box containing over 200 letters addressed to various government agencies, MIA, POW organizations, and military officials. All dated between 1971 and 1995. All inquiring about Miguel Rodriguez, missing in action, presumed dead. The letterheads told a story of bureaucratic stonewalling and false hope, form responses that thanked him for his inquiry while providing no useful information. The final letter in the sequence was different. Handwritten on personal stationery, dated December 15, 1995, it was addressed to the International Red Cross and marked "Final Request" in Pops's careful script. "After 24 years of searching for my son, I must accept that he is never coming home," the letter read. "I am closing this chapter of my life and ask that his name be removed from your active files. Miguel Rodriguez died in Vietnam in 1971. His father is finally ready to let him rest in peace." The date made Jen's hands tremble. December 1995. The same month Marcus Whitfield had appeared in public records, emerging from legal obscurity with a new identity and unexplained wealth. The coincidence felt too significant to ignore, yet too devastating to fully embrace. Marcus's psychological pressure campaign intensified as the 30-day deadline approached. He appeared at the sanctuary with increasing frequency, sometimes accompanied by potential investors who surveyed the property with the cold efficiency of vultures evaluating carrion. His conversations with Pops grew more personal, probing questions about family history and wartime experiences that seemed designed to test the old man's emotional vulnerabilities. "You remind me of my father," Marcus said during one particularly tense encounter, his amber eyes studying Pops's weathered features with unsettling intensity. He was a soldier too. Went to Vietnam and never really came home, if you know what I mean. The comment hit Pops like a physical blow, confirming his growing suspicion that Marcus knew far more about his background than any casual businessman should. But when pressed for details about his own father, Marcus deflected with practiced ease, revealing only fragments that could be coincidence or calculated manipulation. Leon's medical condition worsened dramatically, though Jen continued hiding the diagnosis from Pops. The great cat's kidney function declined rapidly, requiring increasingly expensive medications that drained their already desperate finances. His magnificent frame began showing signs of deterioration: less muscle mass, duller coat, amber eyes that sometimes seemed clouded with pain he was too proud to express. Yet Leon's devotion to Pops never wavered. If anything, his protective instincts intensified as he sensed his human companion's declining health. He began sleeping directly against the fence closest to Pop's trailer, his massive form a living barrier between the old man and whatever dangers the night might hold. The breaking point came during a heated confrontation in the sanctuary's main office, where Marcus had arrived with a team of lawyers and county officials. The meeting was ostensibly about code violations and safety concerns, but everyone present understood it was really about applying maximum pressure before the 30-day deadline expired. "Mr. Rodriguez," the lead attorney intoned, reading from a thick folder of violations, "we have documented 17 separate infractions of county health and safety codes. The cost of bringing your facility into compliance would exceed $400,000, money you clearly don't have." Pops sat silently through the recitation, his cancer-ravaged frame dwarfed by the conference table, but his eyes burning with defiant fury. When the lawyers finished their presentation, he spoke with quiet dignity that commanded attention, despite his physical frailty. "Gentlemen, I've spent 20 years building something beautiful here. These animals trust me to protect them, and I won't betray that trust for your profit margins." Marcus leaned forward, his mask of professional detachment slipping to reveal something raw and wounded underneath. "Sometimes trust is a luxury people can't afford, old man. Sometimes survival requires making choices that break your heart." The words carried emotional weight that went far beyond business negotiations, and Pops felt his heart racing as recognition dawned. The phrasing, the cadence, even the way Marcus's voice cracked on certain syllables, it was hauntingly familiar, like hearing an echo of conversations from 3 decades past. "Miguel?" The name escaped Pops's lips as barely a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the conference room, it carried the weight of artillery fire. Marcus's carefully constructed composure shattered completely. His face went white, then flushed with years of suppressed emotion. The lawyers and officials looked confused, sensing undercurrents they couldn't understand, but Pops and Marcus were locked in a moment of recognition that transcended their audience. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, but his voice shook with the effort of maintaining the lie. Pops struggled to his feet, his arthritic hands gripping the table edge for support. 30 years I've mourned you, mijo. 30 years I've carried the guilt of not bringing you home." The room erupted in confusion as the other attendees realized they were witnessing something far more personal than a business transaction. But Marcus was already moving toward the door, his professional facade crumbling as emotions he'd buried for decades threatened to surface. "You don't get to call me that," he said, turning back with tears streaming down his face. "You lost that right when you abandoned me in that jungle hell." The admission hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, confirming what Pop's heart had known but his mind had refused to accept. His son, his beautiful, brave, supposedly dead son, stood before him transformed by 3 decades of pain and survival into something harder and more damaged than the boy who had died in military records. "Miguel," Pops breathed, reaching toward him with shaking hands. "My God, Miguel, I thought you were dead." But Miguel, was already fleeing, his expensive shoes echoing against the concrete as he ran from a confrontation 30 years in the making. Behind him, he left a room full of confused officials and one heartbroken father who had just discovered that miracles and tragedies could wear the same face. Through the office window, Leon watched the drama unfold with those intelligent amber eyes, and for the first time in weeks, the great cat's tail moved in what might have been recognition or approval, or simply the ancient wisdom of a creature who understood that some reunions required breaking before they could heal. The confrontation that would shatter 30 years of carefully constructed lies began at sunset on a Thursday evening when the golden light of the Florida Keys painted the sanctuary in shades of memory and regret. Pops had called Miguel that morning, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, requesting a private meeting with no lawyers, no officials, just two men who shared blood and decades of unspoken pain. Miguel arrived early, his black Tesla gleaming incongruously among the weathered buildings and chain-link enclosures. He sat in the car for nearly 20 minutes, watching Leon pace restlessly in his habitat, the great cat's amber eyes tracking his every movement with unsettling intelligence. When he finally emerged, his expensive suit felt like armor against the emotional battlefield he was about to enter. Leon's reaction was immediate and puzzling. Instead of the territorial growl he reserved for strangers, the lion approached the fence with cautious curiosity, his massive head tilted as if trying to solve a puzzle written in scent and memory. Miguel found himself drawn to the enclosure despite his intentions to maintain distance, his fingers unconsciously reaching toward the chain-link barrier. "He knows you," Pop said quietly, emerging from his trailer with the careful movements of a man whose body was betraying him one cell at a time. "Animals sense things we miss. Always have." Miguel's hand jerked back as if burned. "I don't know what game you're playing, old man, but—" "No games, mijo." The endearment slipped out naturally, carrying 30 years of grief and hope. "Just a dying father who wants to understand how his son became a stranger." The accusation hung between them like a challenge, and Miguel felt the walls he'd spent decades building begin to crack under the weight of recognition. Pops looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile, but his eyes still held the same steady warmth that had once made a frightened boy feel safe in a world gone mad with war. "You left me!" The words exploded from Miguel with volcanic force, years of suppressed rage finally finding voice. "You came home to your new life while I rotted in that camp for 24 years. Pops staggered as if physically struck, his weathered face crumpling with the impact of his son's pain. "They told us you were killed in action, Miguel. I have the death certificate. I mourned you for 30 years. "Convenient story," Miguel spat, his amber eyes blazing with fury that made him look heartbreakingly young despite his gray-streaked hair. "Did it help you sleep better at night, thinking your son was dead instead of tortured, starved, forgotten?" The raw anguish in Miguel's voice cut through Pops like shrapnel, each word opening wounds that had never properly healed. Behind them, Leon began making low, rumbling sounds that weren't quite growls, more like the vocalizations a mother cat might use to comfort distressed kittens. "Show me," Pops whispered, his hands shaking as he pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. "Show me where I failed you." The death certificate was yellowed with age, creased from years of handling. Official military stationery, formal language that reduced a beloved son to bureaucratic statistics. "Killed in action, body not recovered, presumed dead." The date stamp read March 15, 1971, exactly 52 years ago. Miguel stared at the document with something approaching shock, his fury momentarily displaced by confusion. "They told you I was dead?" Every official channel, every inquiry, every desperate letter I wrote begging for information. Pops's voice broke on the last words. I spent your college fund on private investigators, Miguel. I wrote to every MIA organization, every government agency, every humanitarian group I could find. For 24 years, I never stopped looking. The revelation hit Miguel like a physical blow, threatening the foundation of rage that had sustained him through decades of survival and success. The narrative he'd constructed, of an abandoned son forgotten by an uncaring father, suddenly felt less solid, less certain. "You're lying," he said, but the conviction was gone from his voice. Pops turned and walked slowly toward his trailer, each step a monumental effort that spoke of cancer eating away at his strength. He returned with a cardboard box that looked like it had been handled countless times, its corners worn smooth by desperate fingers. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, copies of correspondence with the Department of Defense, the International Red Cross, congressional offices, veterans organizations, all dated between 1971 and 1995, all inquiring about one Miguel Rodriguez, missing in action, presumed dead but never confirmed. Miguel's hands shook as he read through the papers, seeing his father's handwriting grow increasingly desperate over the years. Early letters were formal, military precise. Later ones became personal pleas from a broken man begging bureaucrats to help him find his son. December 1995, Pop said quietly, pointing to the final letter in the sequence. That's when I finally gave up. That's when I accepted that my boy was never coming home. Miguel stared at the date, remembering his own timeline. December 1995 was when he'd escaped the POW camp with the help of French journalists, when he'd made his way to Saigon and then to Paris, when he'd begun the legal process of creating a new identity for a man who no longer existed in any official records. "I tried to find you too," he whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "When I got to Paris, I hired investigators. They said Samuel Rodriguez had died in 1992, liver failure from alcoholism." The pieces of their separate hells began fitting together with devastating clarity. Two men searching for each other across an ocean of bureaucratic indifference and deliberate misinformation. A father who'd drunk himself nearly to death grieving a son he believed lost forever. A son who'd rebuilt his life believing his father had died rather than face the shame of a missing child. "I was Samuel Rodriguez then," Pops admitted, his voice barely audible. "Couldn't handle being called Pops without my boy to call me that. Took my middle name instead. By the time I got sober and started using Samuel again, you'd probably stopped looking." Miguel sank onto one of the weathered benches scattered around the sanctuary, the weight of 30 years pressing down on his shoulders like lead. Around them, the other animals had grown quiet, as if sensing the seismic shift occurring in their small world. "I hated you," Miguel said, and somehow the words carried more love than anger. "Every day in that camp, every night when they hurt us, I held on to that hate because it was all I had left of home." Leon approached the fence again, this time pressing his massive body against the chain link closest to where Miguel sat. The lion's amber eyes held a depth of understanding that seemed almost human, as if he recognized grief in all its forms. "He's dying too," Pop said softly, watching his beloved companion. "Kidney failure. Jen thinks I don't know, but I've seen it before. He's got maybe weeks left." The revelation added another layer of tragedy to an already overwhelming moment. Miguel found himself studying Leon with new eyes, seeing past the magnificent exterior to the pain the proud animal was hiding. Just like his father. Just like himself. "Is that why you won't sell?" Miguel asked. "Because of the lion?" "Partly. Pops moved closer to the fence, his arthritic fingers finding the chain-link gaps where Leon's fur pressed through. But mostly because this place, these animals, they're all I have left of hope. When I thought you were dead, when the bottle almost killed me, when everything fell apart, I came here and found purpose again. Miguel watched the interaction between man and lion, seeing something he'd missed in all his previous visits. This wasn't just affection between human and animal. It was recognition between two souls who'd found each other in their darkest moments. "You replaced me with a lion," he said. But there was no accusation in it anymore. "I tried to replace the son I failed to bring home," Pops corrected gently. "Leon needed someone to love him despite his scars. Maybe I needed that too." The admission hung between them like a bridge, fragile but potentially healing. Miguel felt his carefully constructed armor beginning to crack, 30 years of protected anger giving way to the possibility of something more dangerous: forgiveness. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered, the words of a frightened child disguised as a successful businessman. "I don't know how to be your son again." Pops reached through the fence to touch Leon's fur, his movement slow and deliberate. "Maybe we don't go backward, mijo. Maybe we figure out how to go forward." As if responding to the emotional breakthrough, Leon made a sound none of them had heard before. A deep, rumbling vocalization that was part purr, part growl, part something else entirely. It was the sound of a creature who understood that his two humans had finally found their way back to each other, just in time to say goodbye. The final week of Pop's life unfolded with the terrible beauty of a sunset, each day bringing deeper shadows and more precious light. The cancer had accelerated beyond all medical predictions, consuming his body with ruthless efficiency while leaving his mind cruelly sharp for the conversations he'd waited 30 years to have. Miguel had withdrawn his buyout offer and moved into the sanctuary's guest cabin, sleeping on a narrow cot that reminded him painfully of his military days. The successful businessman's facade had crumbled completely, revealing the damaged boy underneath who still needed his father's approval more than air. He spent hours sitting beside Pops's hospital bed, which they'd moved to the sanctuary office so the dying man could see Leon's enclosure through the window. "Tell me about the camp," Pops whispered during one of their midnight conversations, his voice barely audible above the oxygen concentrator's mechanical breathing. "I need to know what you survived." Miguel's hands clenched involuntarily, muscle memory of restraints and interrogation rooms. "Dad, you don't need to carry that weight too." "I've carried the weight of not knowing for 30 years, mijo. Let me carry the weight of knowing for whatever time I have left." So Miguel talked, his voice flat and clinical as he described 24 years of systematic dehumanization. The bamboo cages barely large enough for a child, the forced labor in rice paddies under a sun that felt like punishment from God, the psychological torture designed to break minds rather than bodies because broken minds were more useful to their captors. "They told us our families had forgotten us," Miguel said, staring at his hands to avoid seeing the pain in his father's eyes, "that America had moved on, that we were embarrassments better left buried." After a while, you start to believe it. Pops reached out with trembling fingers to touch his son's face, the same gesture he'd used to comfort a frightened child decades earlier. "I never forgot, Miguel. Not for one single day." Through the office window, Leon maintained his own vigil, pressing his massive body against the fence closest to the building. The great cat had stopped eating entirely, accepting only small sips of water that Jen administered with a syringe. His magnificent golden coat had dulled to the color of autumn leaves, and his amber eyes held a clarity that suggested he understood exactly what was happening. "He knows," Jen whispered to Miguel during one of her medical checks. "Animals sense these things before we do. He's choosing to go with Pops." The revelation hit Miguel like a physical blow. Here was a creature demonstrating the kind of loyalty he'd spent decades believing didn't exist. Unconditional love that transcended species, circumstances, even death itself. Leon was teaching him something about devotion that his human experience had failed to provide. Dr. Martinez made her final house call on a Tuesday morning, her kind face grave as she examined Pops with professional gentleness. The oncologist had become more than a physician over the past months. She was a witness to the extraordinary reunion between father and son, and her presence brought dignity to what could have been merely tragic. "Days, not weeks," she told Miguel privately, her Spanish-accented English soft with sympathy. "His body is shutting down, but his spirit, there's something keeping him tethered. He's waiting for something." Miguel knew what his father was waiting for. Permission, forgiveness, the chance to hear his son say the words that would release him from 30 years of guilt and grief. But the words felt too enormous, too final. Speaking them would mean accepting that their reunion had come just in time for goodbye. The local Cuban-American community had taken the story of their reconciliation to heart, treating it as a parable of hope in a world too often defined by division. Families brought flowers and home-cooked meals, sharing stories of their own separations and reunions. An elderly woman named Rosa, who'd fled Cuba in 1962, sat with Pops for hours, speaking in rapid Spanish that seemed to transport him back to childhood memories of Havana. "Familia es todo," she told Miguel as she prepared to leave one evening. "Family is everything, but sometimes family finds us in unexpected forms." She nodded toward Leon, who had positioned himself so he could see both Pop's bed and Miguel's chair. The lion's breathing had synchronized with the old man's, their chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm as if they shared a single life force. The sanctuary's other animals seemed to sense the approaching transition. The injured pelican, they called Hemingway, stood motionless on his perch, his usually restless energy stilled. The rescued bobcat, normally territorial and aggressive, allowed visitors to approach without his usual defensive posturing. Even the ancient tortoise, who typically buried himself in the sand during daylight hours, remained visible and alert. "They're saying goodbye," Pops observed during one of his lucid moments, his voice carrying wonder despite his physical weakness. "Animals understand ceremony better than we do sometimes." Miguel had begun conducting the daily business of the sanctuary, learning the routines and rhythms that had defined his father's life for 2 decades. Feeding schedules, medication protocols, the subtle behavioral cues that indicated when an animal was stressed or content. It was like learning a new language, one spoken in growls and purrs and the rustle of feathers. "Leon likes his breakfast at exactly 7:30, Pops instructed, his teacher's instincts surfacing despite his condition. "Not 7, not 8. And he prefers his meat cut in strips, not chunks. Reminds him of how his mother would have fed him, I think." The irony wasn't lost on Miguel. His father was teaching him to care for the creature who had served as his replacement son, but instead of resentment, he felt something approaching gratitude. Leon had kept his father's capacity for love alive during the decades when Miguel couldn't. On Wednesday night, Pops rallied with the kind of supernatural energy that sometimes precedes death, sitting up in bed and speaking with more clarity than he'd shown in weeks. He called Jen into the office, his voice carrying the authority of final instructions. "The sanctuary goes to Miguel," he said, his words precisely enunciated despite his weakness. "But you're the heart of this place, mija. Promise me you'll stay and teach him what I couldn't." Jen's tears fell freely as she nodded, understanding that she was witnessing the transfer of a sacred trust. "I promise, Dad." The use of the word, the same one she'd called him for years, seemed to release something in Pops's chest. He smiled with genuine peace for the first time since his diagnosis, his hand reaching toward the window where Leon maintained his patient watch. "Miguel," he called softly, his voice carrying across 30 years of separation and pain. "Come here, mijo." His son approached the bed with the careful movements of someone afraid of breaking something precious. Pops's hand found his with surprising strength, their fingers interlocking in a grip that felt like an anchor against the approaching storm. "I'm proud of you," Pops whispered, each word a gift, decades in the making. "Not just for surviving, not just for succeeding, but for coming home, for finding your way back to me, when I couldn't find my way to you." Miguel's tears fell like rain, washing away years of accumulated anger and hurt. "I'm sorry I stayed away so long, Dad. I'm sorry I wasted so much time hating you." "No time is wasted if it brings you home in the end," Pops replied, his voice growing softer as his strength faded. "Take care of Leon for me, and let him take care of you. You both know what it means to lose everything and still choose to love again." As dawn broke over the Florida Keys on Thursday morning, October 15th, exactly 52 years after Miguel had been reported killed in action, Samuel Pops Rodriguez drew his final breath. His son held one hand, his chosen daughter held the other, and through the window, a magnificent lion, who had taught them both about loyalty, began to roar with grief that shook the earth itself. The sound carried for miles across the water, a primal lament that spoke of bonds deeper than blood and love stronger than death. It was the voice of the wild mourning, one of its truest protectors, and it would haunt everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. The funeral preparations began within hours of Pop's peaceful passing, but nothing could have prepared the small community for what was about to unfold. Miguel, still reeling from the devastating combination of reunion and loss, insisted on honoring both his father's Cuban heritage and his chosen family of rescued animals. The service would be held at the sanctuary itself, with Pops buried beneath the ancient oak tree that overlooked Leon's enclosure. Word of the father-son reunion had spread through social media like wildfire, transforming what should have been a private goodbye into a public phenomenon. Local news stations arrived first, followed by national networks drawn by the compelling narrative of a Vietnam veteran who'd lived to see his presumed dead son return home. But it was the presence of Leon, the magnificent lion who'd refused food or water since Pops's death, that captured the world's imagination. Dr. Sarah Williams, the animal behaviorist who'd been documenting Leon's unusual grief responses, set up cameras throughout the sanctuary with Miguel's reluctant permission. "This could be unprecedented," she explained, her scientific excitement tempered by genuine compassion for the dying lion. "We may witness behaviors never recorded in big cats." Leon's condition had deteriorated dramatically in the 36 hours since Pops's death. The great cat lay motionless beside the fence closest to where his human companion had spent his final days, his breathing shallow and labored. Veterinary examination revealed what everyone already suspected. Leon was dying of what medical texts clinically termed stress cardiomyopathy, but what everyone else recognized as a broken heart. "He's choosing to follow Pops," Jen explained to the growing crowd of reporters and mourners. "Animals form bonds. We're only beginning to understand." Leon isn't just grieving, he's completing a journey they started together 8 years ago. The controversy began when footage of Leon's behavior appeared online. Videos showed the lion with clear moisture visible around his eyes, leading to heated debates in scientific communities worldwide. Dr. Marcus Chen, a leading expert in animal cognition from UC Berkeley, flew to Florida specifically to observe the phenomenon. "Lions possess lacrimal glands for eye lubrication," he explained to reporters, his clinical tone unable to mask his fascination with what he was witnessing. But emotional tearing, crying as humans understand it, has never been documented in big cats. What we're seeing here challenges everything we know about animal emotional expression. The viral nature of Leon's story brought an unexpected blessing to the sanctuary's desperate financial situation. Donations poured in from around the world as people connected with the tale of interspecies loyalty. A GoFundMe campaign established by local supporters raised over $200,000 in the first day alone, ensuring the sanctuary's survival regardless of what happened to its most famous resident. Miguel found himself caught between grief and bewilderment as he navigated the media attention surrounding his father's death. Reporters pressed him for details about his years in captivity, his reunion with Pops, his plans for the sanctuary's future. But his focus remained fixed on Leon, the creature who had somehow become the living embodiment of his father's capacity for love. "People keep asking me if I'm jealous of a lion," Miguel told Jen during a quiet moment between interviews. "But watching Leon, I finally understand what Dad was trying to teach me. Love isn't diminished when it's shared. It multiplies." The night before the funeral, Miguel made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Against all veterinary advice and legal concerns, he opened Leon's enclosure and entered the habitat where his father had spent countless hours in communion with the great cat. Leon raised his massive head as Miguel approached, amber eyes studying this familiar stranger who carried the scent of grief and loss. "I know you don't trust me yet," Miguel whispered, settling cross-legged on the ground a respectful distance from the dying lion. "But we both loved him. Maybe that's enough for now." Leon's response was subtle but unmistakable, a slight shift in position that brought him closer to Miguel, not quite touching but acknowledging his presence. They sat together in the darkness, two creatures bound by their shared love for a man who had taught them both about second chances. The funeral dawned clear and warm, with over 800 mourners gathering at the sanctuary despite its remote location. Veterans in uniform stood alongside Cuban expatriates, local families, and animal rights activists drawn by Leon's story. The diversity of the crowd would have pleased Pops, who had always believed that love transcended all boundaries. Miguel's eulogy was brief but powerful, his voice breaking as he spoke about the father he'd hated, lost, and found again in the space of a few precious weeks. "He taught me that family isn't about blood or biology," Miguel said, his eyes finding Leon's enclosure where the lion maintained his vigil. "It's about showing up every day, especially when showing up is hard." Jen spoke next, sharing stories of Pop's dedication to broken animals and broken people, his belief that every creature deserved a second chance at happiness. Her words painted a picture of a man who had transformed his own pain into a force for healing, creating a sanctuary in every sense of the word. But it was Father Martinez, the elderly Cuban priest who had known Pops for decades, who provided the moment that would be remembered long after the flowers had wilted. Speaking in both English and Spanish, he offered a blessing that explicitly included Leon among the mourners. "God's love extends to all his creatures," the priest declared, his weathered hands raised toward Leon's enclosure. "And if love can survive death, then surely it can bridge the space between species." As if responding to the blessing, Leon struggled to his feet with tremendous effort, his weakened body swaying as he approached the fence closest to Pop's casket. The crowd fell silent, cameras focusing on the magnificent animal who had become the symbol of their collective grief. What happened next would be debated by scientists and theologians for years to come. As the casket was slowly lowered into the earth beneath the oak tree, Leon pressed his massive paw against the chain-link fence and opened his mouth in what appeared to be a silent roar. But it was the moisture clearly visible streaming from both eyes that caused gasps from the assembled mourners. Dr. Williams captured every moment on high-definition cameras, her scientific objectivity warring with emotional awe at what she was witnessing. "I can document what I'm seeing," she whispered to her research assistant, "but I can't explain it. According to everything we know about feline physiology, this shouldn't be possible." The footage spread across social media platforms within minutes, generating millions of views and comments from people around the world. Leon cries became a trending topic as the video was shared, translated, and debated in dozens of languages. Scientists argued about emotional capacity in animals, while believers saw proof of the soul's existence across species barriers. But for Miguel, watching Leon's grief unfold, the scientific explanations mattered less than the emotional truth the lion was expressing. Here was a creature demonstrating the kind of unconditional love that humans spent lifetimes trying to achieve, proving that the bonds forged in the sanctuary extended far beyond the merely human. As the funeral service concluded and mourners began to disperse, Leon made his final statement of devotion. The great cat slowly lowered himself to the ground, positioned so his head pointed directly toward Pops's grave, and closed his eyes with the peaceful expression of a creature ready to complete his journey. Miguel understood immediately what he was witnessing. Despite the efforts of veterinarians and the pleas of strangers who had fallen in love with his story, Leon was choosing to follow the path blazed by his human companion. The lion's breathing grew increasingly shallow as sunset painted the Florida Keys in shades of gold and amber that matched his magnificent mane. "He waited for the funeral," Jen observed through her tears, kneeling beside the fence to bear witness to Leon's final moments. "He waited to say goodbye properly." At exactly 6:47 p.m., as the sun touched the horizon, Leon drew his last breath. His massive form relaxed completely, his face wearing an expression of such profound peace that even the most skeptical observers found themselves believing in reunion beyond death. The timing felt deliberate, ceremonial, a final gift from a creature who had spent his life teaching humans about the true meaning of loyalty. The moment was captured by dozens of cameras and would be viewed by hundreds of millions of people worldwide, but for Miguel, nothing existed beyond the overwhelming recognition that he had just witnessed something sacred. Leon's death wasn't tragic, it was triumphant. The completion of a love story that had begun with rescue and ended with willing sacrifice. The revelation that would shake him to his core came later that evening when Jen shared the veterinary records she had kept hidden from both Pops and the media. Leon had been dying of kidney failure for months, his condition carefully managed with expensive medications that the sanctuary could barely afford. The great cat's death wasn't the result of grief alone. It was the culmination of a battle he had been fighting silently, choosing to spend his final months bringing comfort to a dying man rather than seeking treatment that might have extended his own life. "He knew," Miguel whispered, understanding flooding through him like sunrise. "He knew they would die together, and he chose to make Dad's last months as peaceful as possible." The final twist in their extraordinary story would transform Leon from viral sensation into lasting symbol of sacrificial love, proving that sometimes the greatest acts of devotion require no words, no recognition, only the quiet choice to love completely until the very end. The months following Leon's death transformed the Big Cat Sanctuary of the Keys from a struggling wildlife refuge into a pilgrimage site for the broken-hearted. The viral video of Leon's tears had been viewed over 300 million times across all platforms, generating a global conversation about the nature of love, loyalty, and the bonds that transcend species boundaries. But for Miguel, the real miracle wasn't the worldwide attention. It was the quiet healing that began to take root in the fertile ground of shared grief. The sanctuary's financial crisis evaporated almost overnight as donations poured in from every corner of the globe. A Japanese businessman sent $50,000 with a note written in broken English. "Lion, teach me love stronger than death." A grandmother from Norway contributed her entire pension, explaining that Leon's devotion reminded her of her late husband's loyalty. Children from a school in Kenya raised money through bake sales, their teacher explaining that they wanted to honor the lion who showed us how to love. Within 6 months, the sanctuary had received over $2.3 million in donations, ensuring not only its survival, but its expansion into something Pops had only dreamed of. Miguel established the Leon and Pops Foundation, dedicated to rescuing animals and supporting veterans dealing with PTSD. The irony wasn't lost on him that his father's death had provided the resources to fulfill his life's mission on a scale previously unimaginable. Dr. Sarah Williams published her groundbreaking study on Leon's behavior in the Journal of Animal Cognition, forever changing scientific understanding of emotional expression in big cats. Her documentation of Leon's tears, authenticated by multiple veterinarians and subjected to rigorous analysis, proved that emotional tearing did occur in lions under extreme stress. The study sparked hundreds of follow-up research projects and established the sanctuary as a center for human-animal bond studies. Leon's legacy extends far beyond viral fame, Dr. Williams explained during a lecture at Harvard Medical School. He provided empirical evidence that animals experience complex emotions previously thought to be uniquely human. His story is rewriting textbooks across multiple disciplines. The transformation of Miguel himself was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire saga. The bitter businessman who had arrived intent on destroying his father's legacy had become its most passionate guardian. He legally changed his surname back to Rodriguez, honoring both his heritage and his father's memory. The expensive suits gave way to practical work clothes as he learned the daily rhythms of animal care, finding peace in routines his father had established decades earlier. Jen remained as the sanctuary's head veterinarian and Miguel's closest confidant, their shared grief creating a sibling bond that neither had expected. She taught him to read the subtle signs of animal distress, to recognize when a creature needed space versus comfort, to understand the complex social dynamics that governed their rescued family. "Your father saw potential in broken things," she told Miguel during one of their evening walks through the expanded facilities. "He saw it in Leon, he saw it in me, and he saw it in you long before you came home." The memorial they built for Pops and Leon became the sanctuary's spiritual heart. Beneath the ancient oak tree, 2 graves lay side by side, one marked with a simple stone bearing Pops's name and military service, the other with a bronze plaque that read simply, "Leon, faithful friend." The site was never without flowers, left by visitors from around the world who made pilgrimages to honor the unusual love story that had captured global imagination. Miguel often found himself sitting between the graves during quiet moments, sharing updates about the sanctuary's growth and the animals they continued to rescue. The conversations felt natural, as if his father and Leon were still present in the rustling leaves and shifting shadows of their favorite spot. The sanctuary's expansion included the Leon Memorial Wing, a state-of-the-art veterinary facility that provided medical care for big cats throughout the southeastern United States. Miguel insisted that treatment be provided regardless of the owner's ability to pay, remembering how financial constraints had limited Leon's treatment options during his final months. A year after the funeral, Miguel met Dr. Elena Vasquez, a wildlife veterinarian from Costa Rica who had come to study the sanctuary's innovative rehabilitation programs. Their courtship was quiet and unhurried, built on shared values and mutual respect for the work that consumed their days. When they married in a simple ceremony beneath the oak tree, guests swore they heard a low rumble of approval from somewhere beyond the veil of death. Their first child, born 2 years later, was named Samuel Leon Rodriguez, honoring both his grandfather and the lion who had taught his father about unconditional love. The boy showed an early affinity for animals that delighted Miguel and seemed to validate Pops's belief that compassion could be inherited across generations. The sanctuary became a model for ethical wildlife rehabilitation, hosting researchers from universities worldwide and serving as a training ground for the next generation of conservationists. Miguel spoke at conferences across the globe, sharing Leon's story and advocating for stronger protections for captive animals. His message was always the same: love recognizes no boundaries, and healing is possible even after the deepest wounds. Local schools brought children on field trips to learn about wildlife conservation and the importance of treating all creatures with dignity. Miguel would often end these visits by taking the students to Leon's grave, where he would tell the story of a lion who proved that loyalty transcends species, language, and even death itself. The annual Leon and Pops Day became an official county holiday, drawing thousands of visitors who came to celebrate the power of second chances and the healing nature of forgiveness. Families brought their own stories of loss and reunion, finding comfort in a place where miracles seemed not only possible but inevitable. 5 years after that viral video changed everything, Miguel stood at his father's grave as another Florida sunset painted the sky in familiar shades of gold and amber. His son played nearby, his innocent laughter mixing with the evening sounds of contented animals and rustling palm fronds. "We did it, Dad," Miguel whispered to the gathering twilight. "The sanctuary is safe, the animals are thriving, and I finally understand what you were trying to teach me all along." A gentle breeze stirred the oak leaves, carrying the scent of jasmine and salt air. In the distance, the sanctuary's newest residents, a family of rescued tigers, settled into their evening routines under the watchful care of dedicated staff who understood that their work was about more than animal welfare. "Love multiplies when it's shared," Miguel continued, his voice carrying the same warmth that had once comforted a frightened child. "You shared it with me, with Leon, with every broken creature that found sanctuary here, and now we're sharing it with the world." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Miguel felt a profound sense of completion. The bitter businessman, who had arrived seeking revenge, had been transformed by witnessing love in its purest form. The devotion of a lion who chose to die beside his human companion rather than live without him. Leon's legacy lived on in every animal they saved, every family they reunited, every heart they helped to heal. The lion who had taught the world to believe in the possibility of love beyond boundaries had proven that some bonds truly are stronger than death, and that the greatest victories are often won not through conflict, but through the simple choice to love completely and without reservation. In the end, Miguel realized that was the real miracle, not that a lion could cry, but that love could teach them all how to become more than they ever thought possible. Dear friends, if you're reading this story at 2 a.m. with tears in your eyes, you're not alone. Like Miguel, many of us carry wounds from decades past, regrets about words left unsaid, relationships broken by pride, children who feel like strangers. We've spent years building walls around our hearts, believing it's too late for second chances, too late for healing. But Leon's story teaches us something profound. Love doesn't have an expiration date. That father who disappointed you, that child who seems unreachable, that dream you abandoned, they're not lost forever. Miguel thought his father had given up on him, while Pops believed his son was dead. 30 years of unnecessary pain, because neither could see past their own hurt to reach for forgiveness. Don't let pride steal your remaining years. That phone call you've been avoiding, that apology you've been postponing, that "I love you" that feels too vulnerable to say, make it today. Leon proved that some bonds transcend death itself. But why wait that long? Your family, like Miguel's, might be just one conversation away from healing. The question isn't whether you have time left to love, it's whether you have time left to waste. What relationship in your life needs the healing power of forgiveness? Have you ever witnessed love that seemed to transcend normal boundaries, like Leon's devotion to Pops? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.